Good morning or good afternoon, depending where you're joining us from the country. My name is Francesco Tornatori. I'm the Director of the Technology, Innovation and Business Characteristics section in the ABS. And joining me today is Kevin Bolt, who is the Assistant Director of the Business Characteristics Survey. Today we will be conducting this presentation on the characteristics of Australian Business 2021-22 publication. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we are meeting on today. In WA, that's the Noongar Whadjuk people, and pay my respects to their elders, both past, present and emerging, and to acknowledge members of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community who may be attending this presentation today. As you would have seen in the Eventbrite details, we'll be using Poll EV at the end of the presentation to take questions. So please either submit your questions through using the smartphone application or on the URL which is available in Eventbrite. So that's pollev.com/BCS webinar, or in lowercase. So in terms of what we're going to be covering today, a little bit of background about the section that we work in, and then I'll be going through some information about the Business Characteristics Survey, about a little bit about the history, sample design, and some of the users and uses of the collection. And Kevin will take you through some sample outputs that we released last week, just to give a bit of a broad overview of what's available and the different levels of disaggregation available. Then I'll present some information on the innovation module that we'll be conducting or enumerating for later this year, and then also discuss how we're going to be doing some content development review work for the next omnibus or general characteristics version of the collection, and then we'll take some questions and have a bit of a chat at the end. Okay, so this slide just depicts the section that we work in, the Technology, Innovation, Business Characteristics, Statistics section. So as you can see through the slide, we deliver information regarding business characteristics, innovation, research and development, and digital activities or business use of IT. We do this through conducting surveys, so the research and experimental development, where we have 4 sectors that we cover: business, higher education, government, and private not-for-profit. These collections are done on a 2-yearly basis, so we've just finished the enumeration for the business survey, and we'll be publishing the results of that collection at the end of August. And then in the other subsequent years, we do higher education, which we'll be publishing next May, and government, private, not-for-profit, which we'll be publishing next June. Business Characteristics Survey, which is the main topic of focus today, which is an annual survey that has alternating question modules. And we also do quite a lot of engagement across government and academia, and also with international organisations such as the OECD, so we can try and stay at the forefront of best practice and policy monitoring, environmental scanning in this subject matter space. In terms of the use of our statistics, so used quite broadly, so internally by our national accounts team, who principally use the R&D data, both the R&D suite of collections and business characteristics survey is an input to Blade, and one of the main inputs, one of the main use sources of data in Blade. We do a fair bit of international reporting as well. Domestically, DISA, for example, are a heavy user of our data. We've got other examples such as Home Affairs, who use the cybersecurity data, infrastructure, who do things like measure the digital divide, that kind of thing, with some of the statistics that we produce. The size of our team in Perth is about 26 people. During our peak processing periods, it can go up to about 30 people, structured across 4 teams. So we've got the survey operations teams, as well as a team that does some microdata Blade related work, teams that do content development for our collections. Okay, so now we'll dive into the BCS survey. So just a little bit of history and background. So prior to the advent of the BCS in the mid-2000s, the ABS used to conduct separate surveys pertaining to business use of IT and innovation. Then we brought those surveys together because of, I guess, the common aspects between both collections and some of the efficiencies that would yield, and that was done in the mid-2000s, like I said. So in 0506 survey was born, economy-wide survey, and annual survey which collected key measures of business characteristics, innovation, and business use of IT. In more recent times, there has been, I guess, some contemporary user requirements that weren't being met by that model. And in response to that feedback that we had received from users, and also in response to the innovation metrics review a couple of years ago, we undertook a massive overhaul of the collection, which presented an opportunity to address, like I said, some of those recommendations from the innovation metrics review. So things like improved measures of business innovation. So we moved to a 2-year reference period, improved some of our measures of collaboration, and some measures of outcomes of innovation. Another recommendation was to improve and introduce measures, more detailed measures of the digital economy. And also another one was around measuring location-based information for the two topics. So we went ahead and did a review, and I've now published our first iteration post the review of the standalone innovation module and the digital activity and business characteristics survey. So I'll just go into a little bit of detail about the collection. So in terms of the design and scope and coverage, so the sample size of the collection is about 6,500 businesses roughly, and that represents an in-scope business population of about 1 million businesses. It's, like I said, an economy-wide survey. We do exclude public admin and safety and Division P education and training. So in terms of how the survey is structured from year to year, so we, unlike under the old model, now we have just an innovation-specific module where we collect roughly, I think last time was about 38 questions on the innovation survey, specifically just asking innovation questions, so no questions on business structure, performance indicators, general characteristics, or business use of IT. And that collection, and the collection is stratified by employment size, industry division, and by state, and that is in reference to a 2-year reference period for innovation data. And then the outputs that we just released last week, the business characteristics or digital activities focus collection, where we do ask some characteristics and general performance questions, but a heavy emphasis on business use of IT. So that collection, or the outputs that we released last week, I guess is more in line to the original model of the BCS, whereas opposing to in subsequent years and in the next collection year, again, we'll just have a standalone innovation survey. In terms of sort of the users and users, I'll just touch on that briefly. So, things like the information is used heavily through both microdata and estimates. A lot of microdata users do things like looking at the drivers of productivity, whether that be sort of looking at the management practices or how the adoption of technology helps drive productivity improvements or increases. Users, like I mentioned, Department of Infrastructure, for example, be using the data to do things like looking at the digital divide between businesses located in regional areas as opposed to those located in metropolitan type areas. Innovation data, broad usage and by a large user group, and things like looking at understanding how ideas are commercialized and taken to market, or the barriers to those, and if we're looking at ways that government can help support businesses to better commercialise ideas, which is a big barrier in Australia. Users look at things like the characteristics that differentiate innovation and non-innovation active firms. And a broad range of uses there, which are described in the slide. So now I'll throw to Kevin, who will go through some of the outputs that we released last week.
Thanks, Frank. Just to reiterate, my name's Kevin Bolt. So I'm the current Assistant Director for the Business Characteristics Survey, and this is the first iteration of the digital activity module that we've released. So obviously, we'll go through some of the estimates now from this first release of the survey. As Frank highlighted, there's a broad range of topics and levels of output available for the survey. And so we've just selected sort of a few of the examples to present to you today. So this first slide is looking at factors that significantly hampered general business activity for businesses in the year ended 30th of June 2022. So just looking at this graph here, you can see a total of 68% of businesses reported at least one type of factor that was significantly hampering their general business activities. Now, this was up from a figure around 56% of businesses in the reference period, which ended on the 30th of June 2020. Uncertainty about economic conditions was the most commonly reported specific factor that was reported as hampering general business activities, with 36% of businesses reporting this factor. This was closely followed by supply chain issues, with 30% of businesses reporting that particular figure. So just to know that this cycle was the first time we've introduced 3 new options for this question, and they being supply chain issues, uncertainty about economic conditions, and also internet access issues was also introduced for the first time this cycle. Now, in terms of looking at the barriers at an industry level, this slide just presents some additional information. So uncertainty about economic conditions was the most often recorded factor for 11 out of the 17 industries. Now, this was followed by supply chain issues, which was the most often reported by 4 of the 17 industries, and closely followed by lack of skilled persons within the labour market. Now, although the supply chain issues was only the most often factor recorded for 4 of the 17 industries, you can see from the figures here that its impact on those industries was more pronounced than for either the uncertainty about economic conditions or lack of skilled persons within the labour market. The industries most affected by supply chain issues were wholesale trade, 59%, retail trade, 54%, and manufacturing, 51%. So these findings are consistent with sort of anecdotal evidence from providers and also with data that's been published by the ABS in the Business Conditions and Sentiments survey. So as expected, there's been a significant proportion of businesses reported there was some skill shortages in the year ended 30th of June 2022, with a total of 38% reporting any skill shortage. This compares to a figure of 24% for the year ended 30th of June 2020. So this slide shows the top 5 skills used and also the top 5 skills where shortages were experienced for the period ending 30th of June 2022. Now, this particular graph, we've also just provided a comparison with one of the states. So in this instance, we've used WA as a comparison, just so you can get an idea that there are some differences, I guess, between various states and the national figures. Now, some of the factors that have contributed to these skill shortages have included restricted migration, ageing population, skills mismatch between existing skills and employer needs, and the tight labour market. So increased tightening in the labour market was highlighted in the ABS labour force stats, which were recently released, showing that the unemployment rate actually decreased from 4.6% in July 2021 to 3.5% in June 2022. Businesses were also asked for the first time to report on which measures, if any, that they use to address any skill shortages experienced. So this slide presents a table showing the measures used to address these shortages. It also gives a breakdown by the various employment size groups. So the most commonly, frequently reported measure used by businesses was increased wages, with 40.8% of businesses reporting that, followed by increased working hours of existing workforce, which is 38.9%, and increased use of on-the-job internal training at 37.2%. So in this particular instance, you can see that the increased working hours of existing workforce was the second most reported measure overall, but this is being driven by small businesses in the 0 to 4 persons employed range, and this was the primary measure used for this cohort. With the skill shortages in the labour market, working additional hours was often necessary, and this has also been supported by some of the ABS labour force data, which shows that hours worked have increased approximately 8.4% since March of 2020. So this slide shows the internet connection types used by businesses. So it gives a bit of a comparison from 2018-19 right through to the current cycle, 2021-22. Those businesses with an internet connection has obviously reached a saturation point with approximately 98% of all businesses reporting having an internet connection. Mobile wireless, 3G and 4G is still the largest connection type at 50%, but is losing some of the ground to 5G, which sort of tripled from 10% in the year ended 30th of June 2020 to 31% for the year ended 30th of June 2022, as accessibility to 5G improves. The proportion of businesses with any mobile wireless coverage has also increased from 66% in the year ended 30th of June 2020 to 81% in the year ended 30th of June 2022. Businesses were asked for the first time to report on the performance of the business's internet connection in this particular cycle. This slide shows the results broken down by region in which the businesses were operating. So a total of 52% of businesses reported their internet connection was sufficient, whilst 36% reported a mostly sufficient performance, with only 4% actually reporting an insufficient performance. Looking at this graph here, which gives a breakdown by the different locations of the businesses, we can see that, as would be expected, or you might expect, businesses that operated only in regional areas reported the highest dissatisfaction with their internet performance, with 6% of businesses reporting their internet performance as insufficient. Moving on to the next slide. So this one is about e-commerce. So 30% of businesses reported having received online orders, as opposed to 61% of businesses who reported placing online orders. Now, there was a change implemented for this question, for this particular cycle, for the digital activity module, which better aligns with the OEC definitions of e-commerce. And this was at the request of some key stakeholders, so the international comparisons could be made. The key change for this question is that it now excludes any email orders, both for online orders received and for orders placed. So during the year ended 30th of June, as I mentioned, there were 30% reported having received online orders, compared to the figure which was 50% in the 2019-20 cycle. So obviously, with the change in the scope for this particular question, with the exclusion of email orders, this would probably be contributing a lot to the decline, and as such, this is a break in series and is not comparable with previous cycles data. This next slide looks at e-invoicing. And again, we've given a breakdown there by the employment size ranges. So there were 68% of businesses reported issuing any electronic invoicing during the period. A significantly higher proportion of businesses reported issuing electronic invoices not suitable for automatic processing, 58.3%, compared to businesses that reported issuing e-invoices in a standard structure that was suitable for automatic processing, which was at 12.9%. This next slide looks at some of the cybersecurity issues. Now, previously, businesses were only asked if a cybersecurity incident had occurred. So for this particular cycle, the question now includes descriptions of 8 types of cybersecurity incidents, and more than one option may be selected. So you can see in here a list of the top cybersecurity incidents. And in this instance, you can see that scams or fraud was the highest at 16%. So overall, 22% of businesses reported experiencing any cyber security incident in the current period. This compares to 8% for the previous period, which was ending on the 30th of June, 2020. Now, this also aligns with expectations, and also businesses have an increased awareness about hostile cyber activity in recent years. This data also displays some of the impacts of the incidents. And you can see here that obviously some of the highest ones here with loss of time at 34% and downtime of service and prevention of the use of resources or services at 18%. Impact of businesses that experienced an incident. And just moving on to this last slide is looking at some of the measures in place to prevent cybersecurity incidents. So with the rapid rise in cybercrime in recent years, this is a new question that's been added to the module this time around. And 70% of businesses reported using any type of cybersecurity measures. As you can see from here, the most commonly reported measure was regularly updating viruses, checking all protection software, at 62%. A substantial decrease in impacts of cybersecurity incidents was observed from the year ended 2019-20, when it was 81% to the current reference period, which is 56% this cycle. But this could be due to a heightened awareness of cybersecurity incidents and government programs to combat cybersecurity crime, and the fact that now 70% of businesses do have some form of measure in place to combat cyber attacks. This is the first time we've asked this question, so obviously will be our baseline moving forward. That's the end of the estimates from this particular survey, so I will pass back over to Francesco.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I'd just like to point out, so Kevin just went through and gave some example outputs from the latest publication. There are a lot more topics that the collection covers as well. So we've got a range of questions. So for example, questions on business finance, export markets, working arrangements, business processes that technology is used for, social media, cloud computing. And like I said up front, the survey is stratified by employment size, industry, and state. So most of those outputs are available across those 3 categories. So yeah, please encourage you to look at the publication and the data cube downloads, Excel spreadsheets, and ABS Data Explorer to look at the depth and breadth available from the publication. So I'll briefly just now touch on the 2022-23 collection. So we've just finished sort of the development for the innovation module. So after each collection cycle, we go back and do, I suppose, what we call a light touch redevelopment, not like big, large overhaul, but light touch, where we look back at the performance of questions on the form, discuss needs with key users, and do some question development testing and to essentially refine the survey ready for the next cycle. So what we ended up with for the 2022-23 innovation module is a 38 question survey. For the benefit of our microdata users, we try to make minimal change or any change where really required. The collection for next cycle is mostly no change compared to the first innovation module. We did make some changes to the question on innovation expenditure because we weren't able to output that last year. So we've come up with hopefully an improved question that is fit for purpose for users and a question that we'll be able to output data from. We also worked really closely with DQ and DISA to develop some new questions around the environmental impacts or benefits of innovation. And this is something that we've also worked with the OECD on and something that a number of countries are now looking to collect information on. And the survey enumeration will begin in October and go through till March next year, with the publication coming out in a similar time to this year's publication, so around sometime in June next year, with then data being output by state, industry, and employment size. Okay, so in terms of the omnibus or digital activities survey that we just released, so we'll also be looking at doing some light touch content development and refinement work commencing from next month through to about March next year. So this work will be based on question performance, so things like individual question response rates from this cycle, user feedback and demand. So we'll be starting to undertake that work. There are a number of constraints that we work within when we undertake this light redevelopment, like I mentioned. So things like provider or cognitive burden, we cannot increase the provider burden that we're placing on businesses. So we really should be looking to keep it the same or even reduce provider burden. So, we've got a set sort of number or rough cognitive load that we need to work within. And so we won't be able to introduce another sort of 10, 15 questions on the survey due to demand. So that's sort of one of our main principal drivers. The topic or question that people propose to us needs to be relevant and to the in-scope business population and not too specific. So, for example, we won't be able to ask a question specific to, say, the mining industry, for example. It has to be something that's relevant and can answered by businesses across the economy, across the various sizes. The proposed question topic change must have a clear policy link. And the big thing is that we're looking at whether there are any alternate data sources on the question or topic available. So we look at whether there's admin data or big data or other survey data available that can answer the question that is being proposed. So in terms of how we go about actually undertaking this light touch redevelopment, we like to co-design a lot of the questions with key users and the people that are proposing the questions, and then we take that idea or question that people are looking to have answers for, and we get input from our respondent collection methodology experts, and we'll most likely undertake up to 3 rounds of testing. So these are conceptual testing where we might take a concept, not actually ask questions, but actually test business understanding of a particular concept, then develop some actual questions and do a second round where we actually take the questions through and test the understanding with businesses, what we call a cognitive testing format, where we'll sort of ask businesses and prompt them about the questions that they're being asked about. And then our final round of testing is traditionally an observational round, where essentially we'll take the whole collection instrument and ask businesses to go through those instruments and talk out loud to us and describe things like data availability, how difficult or not it may be to provide that information, and also to talk through any sort of issues that they have with interpretation questions. So if you'd like to propose a topic or question for collection in the 2022-23 Omnibus or Digital Activity module, please email the address presented on screen. So technology.and.innovation.wdb@abs.gov.au. Like I say, this feedback and content requests from stakeholders in many cases and many years is quite significant, and obviously we won't be able to cater for all needs, and we have those constraints that I mentioned. So we do have a bit of a decision-making framework that we use to help guide our decisions around what content does make the final collection, and also, like I said, to help our microdata users as well. Like sort of longitudinal analysis, we won't be making mass overhaul changes to the collection just if there's a real clear policy demand in certain cases, or whether the question performance was an issue this cycle that we've just gone through. Okay, so now is the time to take some questions or feedback. So please use Poll EV, and we have someone assisting Kevin who will be showing the questions. So Kev, I'll throw you to read them out as they come through, please.
Yep. We haven't received any as yet, so I encourage people, if you've got any questions, to take the opportunity and put them through now, and we'll try and answer them for you.
Anything we can't answer today, we'll definitely take on notice and get back to you. We have people's email addresses of those that signed up via Eventbrite. Maybe we've done such a great job of presenting the information that there aren't any questions.
No, there's nothing come through as yet, so.
If you have any questions that you think of post-event, you can also email the email address that I presented on the previous slides, in the technology.and.innovation.wdb@abs.gov.au, or you could also email Kevin or myself directly. So that's just our first name dot second name @abs.gov.au. So francesco.tonsbury@abs.gov.au. Anything, Kevin? Otherwise, we.
Yep. Had our first one come through. Will estimates by state, by industry be available? Unfortunately, estimates will be available by state or by industry, but we can't cross-classify state by industry simply due to the sample size of the collection. That's not possible, unfortunately.
Yeah, we have had a look. We have investigated in the past with our methodology experts around what sample size we'd need in order to output at that level. Unfortunately, I think it was almost like triple the size of the current sample to be able to have enough contributing units down to that level, which would increase provider burden on an aggregate too significantly, and also from a resources perspective, it's not something that we can afford at the moment.
Do have another one that's come through. How will the BCS update affect linking with other Blade modules?
Yeah, so I did mention that we try not to change too much year on year. So we do, when we did the large overhaul a couple of years ago, we did consult with a number of Blade users about their requirements. And one of the messages that did come through quite strongly from a number of Blade users was that change from year to year well, from collection to collection because the topics change year to year, but change from collection to collection should be minimal if possible. But we do sort of try and balance up, like I said, question performance with those needs of users. So, for example, like I said, last innovation module, so the first overhauled innovation module, we had questions on innovation expenditure. We attempted to collect the information from businesses. There was a high question on response rate. And subsequently, when we spoke to businesses during the processing part of the survey cycle, feedback was that they couldn't interpret the question. They weren't sure what they had to answer, and in some instances, the business records didn't allow them to provide expenditure figures at the levels that we were asking for. And therefore, essentially, the question failed, and we weren't able to output anything from that question. So in that instance, we had to go back to the drawing board, work with our users around what their information needs were in terms of innovation expenditure, and we redeveloped the question. So yes, the question has changed, but well, in that instance, it wasn't available anyway in Blade because of the issues with the question. But I guess, yeah, we do change because of performance, and the other one being around demand or around things like, change in technology. So we've got questions about, business technology adoption and lists of different technology types. But as technology evolves and new technologies become available, we do make tweaks to the questions from year to year. But yeah, we do try and maintain the questions as much as we can. Anything else, Kevin?
There's a couple more come through. So how did COVID impact the most recent estimates? Did COVID have any impact on the response rates?
So COVID did impact the estimates. I think when Kevin was highlighting things like the barriers to business activity, some of those prevailing economic conditions during COVID, like the supply chain issues, came through really strongly. And so, yeah, it's definitely reflected in the data and the change in some of those outputs over time. In terms of the response rate, so our response rate was 77% this last cycle. Response rates have become more and more of a challenge for the for the ABS in general, in recent times. Historically in BCS, we used to get about 90% plus in terms of response rate. It's twofold. I think there's issues with cybersecurity and that kind of thing, which potentially is impacting. The ABS has less resources now to do what we call intensive follow-up. So we have a group of people based in Geelong who essentially phone businesses and contact them to try and get them to respond to collections. Those resources have diminished or are a lot smaller now, so that definitely impacted response rates. COVID probably to an extent did as well because things like people working in remote locations, not necessarily in the office, means that when they're doing intensive follow-up calls, there may not always be someone there to pick up the phone as well. So probably has had an impact.
Okay, the next question was, how did you select the businesses involved in the survey?
Yep, so we have a methodology experts who undertake random sampling based on the stratification items, so looking by employment size, industry, state. And there is information available if you refer to the methodology page of the publication, which goes through some of those details. So around the scope and coverage of the survey sample, the scope coverage, the stratification, and the sample.
Okay, the last one there is, were there any findings from last cycle that surprised you?
Kevin, anything that surprised you?
Not specifically. I think most of it was in line with expectations this time around. I think the only thing was the interesting fact that although cyber attacks had gone up, that the actual impacts had gone down, and sort of drawing that line with perhaps it's because of the high number of preventative measures that businesses have in place now as compared to previous, which unfortunately we don't have that comparative figure.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting over time as we collect this information again, 2 years, to see how that changes as well, and whether incidents do increase even more, but whether the level of impact stays stable or potentially even decreases as businesses become more aware of threats of cybercrime and hence put measures in place to combat that. Anything else, Kevin?
And no, that's it, I think.
Okay, yeah. So like I said, please feel free to email us with any follow-up questions that you may have. Like I said, please, take a look at the publication and the Excel data spreadsheets and OBS Data Explorer, and more information is also available around the methodology of the collection, sample design. Refer to the link in the publication. But thank you very much for joining us today. I hope you got some insights out of this presentation, and we look forward to engaging with people in the content development space as well. Thanks again. Cheers.